The community was terribly shocked this morning to hear that an aged man and his wife had fallen victims to the thirst of a murderer and that an atrocious deed had been committed. The news spread like wildfire, and hundreds poured into the 2nd Street. The deed was committed at number 62 2nd Street, where for years Andrew J. Borden and his wife had lived in happiness. It is supposed that an axe was the instrument used, as the bodies of the victims are hacked almost beyond recognition. Since the discovery of the deed, the street in front of the house has been blocked by an anxious throng, eagerly waiting for the news of the awful tragedy and vowing vengeance on the assassin. The first intimation the neighbors had of the awful crime was a groaning, followed by a cry of murder. Miss Adelaide Churchill, who lives next door to the Bordens, ran over and heard Miss Borden cry, "Father is stabbed, run for the police." Mrs. Churchill hurried across the way to the livery stable to get the people there to summon the police. John Cunningham, who was passing, learned of the murder and telephoned to police headquarters, and Officer Allen was sent to investigate the case. Meanwhile, the story spread rapidly and a crowd gathered quickly. A Herald reporter entered the house, and a terrible sight met his view. On the lounge in the cozy living room on the 1st floor of the building lay Andrew J. Borden dead. His face presented a sickening sight. Over the left temple a wound 6x4 had been made, as the head had been pounded with the dull edge of an axe. The left eye had been dug out, and a cut extended the length of the nose. The face was hacked to pieces, and the blood had covered the man's shirt and soaked into his clothing. Everything about the room was in order, and there was no signs of a scuffle of any kind. Upstairs in a neat chamber in the northwest corner of the house, another terrible sight met the view. On the floor between the bed and the dressing case lay Mrs. Borden, stretched full length, one arm extended, and her face resting upon it. Over the left temple the skull was fractured, and no less than 7 wounds were found about the head. She had died evidently where she had been struck, for her blood life formed a ghastly clot on the carpet. Dr. Bowen was the first physician to arrive, but life was extinct, and from the nature of the wounds it is probable that the suffering of both victims was very short. The police were promptly on hand, and strangers were kept at a distance. Miss Borden was so overcome by the awful circumstances that she could not be seen, and kind friends led her away and cared for her. A squad of police who had arrived conducted a careful hunt over the premises for trace of the assailant. No weapon was found, and there was nothing about the house to indicate who the murderer might have been. A clue was obtained, however. A Portuguese, whose name nobody around the house seemed to know, has been employed on one of the Swansea farms owned by Mr. Borden. About 9 o'clock this man went to the house and asked to see Mr. Borden. He had talked with his employer and asked for the wages due him. Mr. Borden told the man he had no money with him, to call later. If anything more passed between the men, it cannot be learned. At length the Portuguese departed, and Mr. Borden soon afterwards started downtown. His first call was to Peter Leduc's barber shop, where he was shaved about 9:30. He then dropped into the Union Bank to transact some business, and talked with Mr. Hart, treasurer of the Savings Bank, of which Mr. Borden was president. As nearly as can be learned, after that he went straight home. He took off his coat and composed himself comfortably on the lounge to sleep. It is presumed from the easy attitude in which his body lay that he was asleep when the deadly blow was struck. It is thought that Mrs. Borden was in the room at the time, but was so overcome by the assault that she had no strength to make an outcry. In her bewilderment she rushed upstairs and went into her room. She must have been followed up the stairs by the murderer, and as she was retreating into the furthest corner of the room, she was felled by the deadly axe. The heavy fall and subdued groaning attracted Miss Borden into the house. There the terrible sight which has been described met her gaze. She rushed to the staircase and called the servant, who was washing windows in her room on the 3rd floor. So noiselessly had the deed been done that neither of them was aware of the bloody work going on so near them. To police officer, Miss Borden, said she was at work in the barn about 10 o'clock. On her return, she found her father in the sitting room with a horrible gash in the side of his head. He appeared at the time as though he had been hit while in a sitting posture. Giving the alarm, she rushed up the stairs to find her mother, only to be more horrified that the person lying between the dressing case and the bed sweltering in a pool of blood. It appeared as though Mrs. Borden had seen the man enter, and the man, knowing his dastardly crime would be discovered, had followed her upstairs and finished his fiendish work. It was a well-known fact that Mrs. Borden always left the room when her husband was talking business with anyone. A person knowing this fact could easily spring upon his victim without giving her a chance to make an outcry. Miss Borden had seen no person enter or leave the place. The man who had charge of her father's farm was held in the highest respect by Mr. Borden. His name was Alfred Johnson, and he trusted his employer so much that he left his bank book at Mr. Borden's house for safekeeping. The young lady had not the slightest suspicion of his being connected with the crime. As far as the Portuguese suspected of the crime was concerned, she knew nothing of him, as he might have been a man who was employed by the day in the busy season. What his motive could have been is hard to tell, as Mr. Borden had always been kind to his help. Another statement made by the police, in which thought apparently light would bear investigation, is the following. Some 2 weeks ago, a man applied to Mr. Borden to the lease of a store on South Main Street that was vacant. After a short time, as Miss Borden was passing the room, loud words were heard, her father making the remark, "I will not let it for that purpose." Quietness was restored in a short while, and when the man departed, her father said, "When you come to town next time, I will let you know." This was 2 weeks ago, but in the meantime the store has been let to another party. But why would a person commit such a brutal affair because of being refused the rental of a store is hard to see. Miss Borden thinks that the party wanted the store for the sale of liquor, and her father refused. It was dark at the time of his calling, and she did not recognize his features. At 12:45, Marshal Hillard and officers Doherty and Connors procured a carriage and drove over to the farm, hoping that the suspected man would return there in order to prove an alibi. The officers will arrive at the place some time before the man, as the distance is some 10 miles, though it is hardly probable that he will return there. What makes it rather improbable that the man suspected is a Portuguese laborer is the statement of Charles Gifford of Swansea. Mr. Gifford says the only Portuguese employed on the upper farm is Mr. Johnson, and he is confirmed to his bed by illness. Another man might be employed by Mr. Borden on the lower farm for a few days, but he does not believe it. An attempt was made to reach Swansea by telephone, but no answer was received. Among the significant incidents revealed in the search through the premises was brought to light by John Donnelly, who with others searched through the barn to see if any trace of the fugitive could be found there. In the hay was seen the perfect outline of a man, as if one had slept there overnight. Besides this, it was evident that the sleeper was either restless or had been there before, because an imprint was found in another part of the hay that corresponded with the outlines at the first impression. Somebody must have been in the habit of going there for a nap, but the imprint was that of a person about 5 feet 6 inches tall, and was shorter than Mr. Borden. This has given rise to the suspicion that the murderer may have slept about the place and waited for an opportunity to accomplish his deed. Another sensational story is being told in connection with the murder. It appears that the members of the family have been ill for some days, and the symptoms were very similar to those of poison. In the light of subsequent events, this sickness has been recalled. It has been the custom of the family to receive its supply of milk from the Swansea farm every morning, and the can was left out of doors until the servant opened the house in the morning. Ample opportunity was afforded, therefore, for anybody who had a foul design to tamper with the milk, and this circumstance will be carefully investigated by the police. Medical examiner Donlin who promptly responded to the call for his presence, made a careful examination of the victims and reached the conclusion that the wounds were inflicted by a heavy, sharp weapon like an axe or hatchet. He found the skull fractured in both instances and concluded that death was instantaneous. As to the blow which killed Mrs. Borden, he thought that it had been delivered by a tall man who struck the woman from behind. It is reported that Mrs. Borden received a letter this morning announcing the illness of a very dear friend and was preparing to go see her. This letter has turned out to be a bogus one, evidently intended to draw her away from the house. In this case, it would look as if the assault had been carefully planned. A suspicious character was seen on 2nd Street this morning who seemed to be on the lookout for somebody, and the police have a description of the man. Marshal Hilliard, officers Dowdy and Connors went to Swansea this afternoon, but found the men at work on the upper farm who had been employed there of late. The lower farm will be visited at once. William Eddy has charge of this one. At 2:15, a sturdy Portuguese named Antonio Orero was arrested in a saloon on Columbia Street and brought into the police station. The man protested his innocence and sent after Joseph Chavez, clerk for Talbot and Co., who recognized the man, and he was immediately released. Andrew J. Borden was born in this city 69 years ago. By perseverance in industry, he accumulated a fortune. A short time since, he boasted that he had yet to spend his first foolish dollar. Mr. Borden was married twice. His second wife was the daughter of Oliver Gray and was born on Rodman Street. He had 2 children by his first wife, Emma and Elizabeth. The former is out of town on a visit and has not yet learned of the tragedy. Mr. Borden was at the time of his death president of the Union Savings Bank and director in the Durfee Bank, Globe Yarn, Merchants, and Troy Mill. He was interested in several big real estate deals and was a very wealthy man. Fall River, Massachusetts, August 1st, 1892. Policemen, owl-like and solemn, made a cordon all day around the queer old house where on Thursday a harmless old man and his wife were so cruelly butchered. All day other policemen, equally owl-like and equally silent, careered over the town on a kind of hopeless hunting. All day the mysterious chief of the owl-like police and the more mysterious county detective went hither and thither in strange fashion. Yet at the end of their day of inscrutable labor, they knew apparently no more about the murder of A.J. Borden and his wife than they knew at the beginning, and no more than the crowds that gaped all day over the palings about the gruesome house. Still, there were actual developments enough and indications enough to induce action in a police force not divided against itself and not ruled by 20 heads instead of one. For one thing, there was news from Boston about the chemical analysis that are being made there. Medical examiner Dolan, who holds a position like that of a coroner in New York, received this news and, except to the police, refused to tell exactly what it was. The medical examiner is a firm and shrewd and clear-headed man, and nothing was to be gained from him, but it was repeatedly asserted during the day from a source that led back to the police that poison had been discovered in the contents of the stomach sent to Boston for analysis. Now this is one of the reports that cannot be authentically fathered, and of course Chief of Police Hilliard denies it. He denies everything, but for all that it seems to rest on good authority. Just as soon as the medical examiner got the word, whatever it was, he sent quickly with an assistant to the cemetery where the bodies were still in the receiving vault and removed organs which are supposed to be wanted for further tests. It is quite certain that this would not have been made in the stomach analysis. Yet the police made no move, notwithstanding that the contingency that a discovery of poison has been supposed to have but one meaning, and it is very well known who attempted to buy poison only the day before the murder. There is something strange about this. It is notorious now that yesterday the police had made all their arrangements for the first arrest in the case. It was distinctly understood that after the father had returned from the funeral, a member of who has been under suspicion since Thursday night, should be taken into custody. For some reason, this plan was abandoned. Yesterday morning, there appeared on the scene Emery D. Hoscombe of Boston, assistant manager of Pinkerton's New England agency, and a very able detective. But Mr. Hanscom was not employed by the authorities, nor for the purpose of tracing the wonderfully clever assassin who produced this puzzling mystery. He was and is employed by the family to look after its interests. What a family so situated may want of a private detective I cannot imagine, but there is a story that he exerted his influence to prevent their arrest, and that was the police changed their plan. Mr. Hanscom's time is chiefly spent at the Mellon House in affable conversation with the newspaper men in whose affections he has made great progress. But if anybody asks him what is he doing here, he says he has come to fish, and if asked what he thinks of the case, he has scarcely heard of it. Only he thinks it would be a shame to arrest any person without evidence enough to convict. That, by the way, exactly coincides with the present opinion of the tall and stately Chief Hillard when he is asked why he does not make a move in the case. When the suspicion seems to be so obvious, and the suspected persons are having a fine opportunity for communication, if not escape. Nevertheless, the weird story is working itself clear with the aid of the police of the mass inventions and lies that formerly clogged it. There was, for example, a fine circumstantial story that let loose in the morning papers about the unknown man, famous in New York police reports. This mysterious being called last Monday at Mr. Borden's house, leaving a companion in a buggy outside. Just before the time of the murder, that is about 10:30 Thursday morning, he called again and was afterwards seen climbing over the fence at the rear of the house, being easily distinguishable by a pair of baseball shoes and his odd patterned trousers. Even the name of the witness, a respectable woman who lives opposite the Bordens, was given to bolster up this interesting narrative. Then the story led to a neighboring village and a band of gypsy horse dealers, and then the strange man disappears. Patient inquiry disposes of this yarn. There was no such, and the witness summoned to say there was utterly denied that she said anything of the kind. Then there was also an interesting anecdote to the effect that when the Borden servant girl heard of the murder, she said it was the Portuguese. But it appears that the servant girl said nothing of the kind, and there is no Portuguese known in this part of the world available for the character of the murderer. Stories of quarrels with various persons, of unknown enemies and secret plots have readily been destroyed by application to Mr. Borden's acquaintances. Mr. Borden did not quarrel, and it is inconceivable that he had any secret enemy. It might be interesting to know the source of all these imaginings, which cloud more or less a clear view of what facts have been settled. The case, no doubt, is pretty dark, and yet I think the most puzzling thing about it is to go to the house and examine the premises, and then tell how the murders could have been committed by an assassin who was able to make his escape from such a place. The old-fashioned frame house of the Borden stands in the middle of a block on a street that is half a residence and half a business street, and in the midst of almost the busiest part of Fall River. The front wall is only 16 feet from the sidewalk, where at all hours of the day people are passing, for the street is a main thoroughfare. The next house on the north is only 20 feet away. The next house on the south is 24 feet away. Both have many windows opening upon the Borden house. There's a small yard at the rear, surrounded by a high, unbroken board fence guarded by barbed wire. On all sides are the yards of neighbors and houses. A small barn stands at one side of the Borden yard. It is not used now except for a storehouse. The house is very old. On the north side there is an entrance going into the kitchen and sitting room, and a flight of stairs leading on the second floor. The only other entrance is the front door opening from the side. These are the dry details, but they are necessary to understand this remarkable story. Mr. Borden owned a great deal of real estate, was president of a savings bank, and had other interests, and Thursday morning, as usual, went about looking after his affairs. All that is positively known about his taking off is quickly told. He started for home about 10:30. About 11:15, his servant girl ran over to Dr. Bowen, who lives across the narrow street, and told him that her master had been murdered. Mr. Bowen, going with the girl, found Mr. Borden lying dead on the lounge in the sitting room, his head mangled in the manner before described. A few minutes afterward, the body of the wife was discovered in a room upstairs, the second one from the street on the south of the house. There were 2 persons in or about the house at the time of the murder. These were Lizzie Borden, the second daughter, and the servant girl named Sullivan. Of course, their stories of what they observed should be of the greatest importance. Sifted of some gratuitous additions, what Lizzie Borden told the police was when her father came home, he lay down in the sitting room and read his paper. The servant girl was upstairs. She herself went out to the barn to get some lead sinkers to use on a fishing trip she was going to take. She was gone about 20 minutes when she came back and found her father butchered. She called to the servant girl, who brought Dr. Bowen. She heard nothing and saw nothing of the murderer. The servant girl says she was at work cleaning windows in the front room upstairs and heard nothing until Miss Lizzie called her. But there are ascertained facts with which Miss Lizzie's story does not fit. Supposing the murderer had been somebody who entered the house and then escaped from it after the bloody deed, how did he get away? Not out of the front door, certainly, for then he would have been seen by somebody in the passing throngs. The only other exit was the back door, but it is directly opposite a window in the adjoining house, and at the window sat during all this time Mrs. Buffin, the lady of the house, who says nobody went in or out the door until the servant ran out on her way to Dr. Bowen's. But supposing the murderer to have got into the backyard unobserved by Mrs. Buffin, he must then climb the high board fence and get over the barbed wire without being seen. And when he had done that, he would be in the yard of a neighbor, from which the only way out was past the neighbor's house, and windows and very front door upon a street almost as much traveled as the one in front. The fence is covered with dust and shows no sign that anybody has climbed it. The barbed wire has not been disturbed nor torn anybody's clothing. Nobody was seen in Mr. Borden's nor any of the yards. These considerations are entirely aside from the fact that there was no apparent motive for the murder. Mr. Borden not being robbed and nothing in the house being disturbed. There is still more to this. Neither the servant girl nor the people in the adjacent house heard an outcry nor a sound of struggle. Yet Mr. Borden was in fair health, and Mrs. Borden was a robust, powerful woman. Therefore it is argued that either they must have been under the influence of drugs, or their assailant was a person of whom they had no fear. More remarkable than this even was the result of today's investigation. Satisfied medical examiner Dolan that Mrs. Borden was killed at least an hour before her husband. This appears from the statement of Dr. Bowen that when he arrived, Mr. Borden's body was warm and the blood was flowing, but Mrs. Borden's body was cold and stiff. During the hour that elapsed, where was the murder? He must have been concealed somewhere about the house. But it would have been impossible for an outsider to know when Mr. Borden would come home. The murderer must therefore have stayed upon the very scene or his first crime, not knowing what happened, what moment it might be discovered, and he with it. Though immediately after his second murder he disappeared so amazingly that no one can guess how he went. The first question Dr. Bowen asked of Lizzie when he reached Mr. Borden's side was, "Where is your mother?" "She's gone out," said Lizzie. "She went out 2 hours ago to see a sick friend who wrote a note asking her to go see her." A few minutes afterward, Mrs. Borden's body was found upstairs. No trace of any such note has been discovered anywhere about the house, and although every man, woman, and child in Fall River has heard about it, nobody has come forward to acknowledge the writing of it. When Lizzie found her father had been murdered, she called for the servant girl, not for her mother. The note would account for this strange omission if the note or any trace of it could be found. The wounds on Mrs. Borden's head offer a wide field for theorizing. First, she was struck a straight blow in front of her forehead, delivered either when she was standing or when she reclined upon her back. This was with the edge of the hatchet. The other blows were along the side of her head and dealt with the back of the hatchet. The body lay face downward on the floor 6 feet from the bed, yet the servant girl at work on the same floor did not hear it fall. How did it get into that position? This was one of the puzzles for which nobody has suggested an adequate solution. The hemorrhage was very small from both bodies. This was what started and gave color to the idea that Mr. and Mrs. Borden had been poisoned before they were butchered. Then it was discovered that the day of the murder, a woman said to be Miss Lizzie Borden had tried to obtain prussic acid at the neighboring drugstore. Today I learned from a very fair sort of witness that on Wednesday almost the whole family became suddenly sick, and that Mrs. Borden said she thought it was something in the food. This witness is John V. Morse, the brother of Mr. Borden's first wife and an inmate of the house, who had not gone entirely free from suspicion, notwithstanding it appears he was not in the neighborhood at the time of the murder. I saw Mr. Morse at the Borden house this morning. He is a commonplace-looking man, about 40 years old, tall, lank, with a rugged beard and shallow gray eyes. He was not willing to say much for publication heretofore, but today consented to tell the Herald his full story. He said, "I returned to Fall River from New Bedford on Wednesday afternoon, after a drive from Swansea and back, came to Mr. Borden's house, and stayed there that night. The next morning I had breakfast about 7 o'clock, and at 8:45 I left Mrs. Borden upstairs. I hadn't seen her since 8. Mr. Borden left me at the door, asking me to come home to dinner. I went to the post office and several other places about town, and finally to Daniel Emery's at No. 4 Wayspot Street. I stayed there until between quarter after and 11:30. When I started for home by streetcar, it was 20 minutes to 12 when I got home and heard of the murders. The house was full of policemen and people. That's all I know about it." "Mr. Morse," I said, "it's been asserted that when Lizzie Borden was away the week before the murder she went to New Bedford to see you." "That is not true," said Mr. Morse vehemently. "She did not see me. I didn't get any letters from her either, though I heard she was at Marion." Mr. Morse admitted that there had been an ill feeling between Mrs. Borden and her stepdaughters, but he would not discuss the matter further. Lizzie, he said, was a peculiar girl, often given to fits of sullenness. His statement about his whereabouts during the morning of the murder had been fully corroborated, and persons who were on the streetcar with him when he went home testified to the fact. Perhaps it was only Mr. Morse's furtive and unhappy manner when he talked that directed any suspicion toward him. The Borden household must have been rather a grim sort of place. Mr. Borden himself, though perfectly respectable and upright, was not particularly cheerful, and between his wife and stepdaughters there was an open war. The elder daughter, Emma, is described of a mild and gentle disposition, but there is little mildness about Lizzie, 7 years her junior. Mr. Borden was worth $500,000, and though penurious as a rule, was inclined to be generous to his household. But Lizzie resented his liberality toward the stepmother. Her own mother died giving birth to her, and she had been odd all her life. She grew up to be much of a recluse. She is far from homely, though not particularly handsome, but she never had a lover, and avoided the company of young men, and has never gone into society. She has her defenders who say she is an amiable disposition. The allegation to the contrary may be a mere ill-natured gossip. One thing is certain, she has wonderful self-possession. When with Dr. Bowen, she stood by her father's body when her mother was discovered murdered. At the time of the funeral, and on all other occasions since the story began, she has manifested, they say, almost unshakable calmness. She is a masculine-looking woman with strong, resolute, unsympathetic face. She is robustly built, 33 years old and of average height. Her voice has a peculiar guttural harshness. Her hair is brown and long, and her eyes brown and steady. Her self-possession is expressed in her looks. I do not think she is afraid of many things. She must know that she is under constant police espionage and suspicion, but there is nothing in her appearance to show that she is concerned about it. She declined today to make any statement about her case. The mayor of Fall River is the real head of police force, though at present his direction of it is hampered by the opposition of a majority of the board of aldermen, who will not confirm his appointments nor assist in his plans. The present mayor is Dr. Coughlin. He has taken an active interest in the Borden case as any detective here, and has formed his theory of the mystery, which is not different from that held some other. Mayor Coughlin said tonight that the inquest would probably begin on Tuesday, when he thought Professor Woods of Harvard, who is making the analysis of the stomach, would make his report. Patrolman Hayes distinguished himself tonight by suddenly reporting that on the morning of the murder he had seen a man loitering about in front of the Borden residence. He gave sort of a half description of the man. As nobody saw him and Hayes did not explain why he had held back his information, the clue is not regarded as greatly important. When the house was searched yesterday afternoon, 2 hatchets and 2 axes were found and taken to the police headquarters. One of the hatchets was stained and looked as if an attempt might have been made to clean it. It was turned over to a local physician that the stains might be analyzed. It was this afternoon that experts had decided that the stains were blood. Chief of Police Hiller denied that there is anything in this. He said that some people thought the stains were blood and some said they were only rust, and nobody could tell until a scientific test had been made. As to the fact that no arrest had been made, Chief Hiller said that the police were working slowly but surely and taking up one clue after another, and when they reached one that seemed to be upheld with testimony enough to convict, they would make an arrest. He predicted that would be within 2 to 3 days. Excitement in the police circles ran high this evening when it was reported that an unknown woman had been found murdered in a lonely spot in South Somerset near Williams Pond. Investigation showed that Mary Gifford, about aged 27 years, was dead and had been found lying in some bushes near a stone wall, her position indicating that she had fallen naturally from weakness. There were 2 bottles near her, both of which smelled strongly of liquor. Medical examiner Dolan was in doubt as to whether or not the woman had been treated violently before death, and he proposes to hold an autopsy tomorrow or the next day. Mrs. Gifford was well known in the police circles as Portsmouth Mary and a dissolute character. At a late hour it is reported that the suspicions of blood spots on the hatchet in possession of the police are well founded, and that there is every reason to believe that members of the family are directly accountable for the death of the 2 victims.